Hi, welcome back to The Basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today we conclude our long, in-depth look at U.S. pop culture in the year 1972. Last time we made a start on talking about the fourth quarter, the months of October, November, December. This time we'll wind it up and hopefully bring 1972 in for a smooth landing. And let's begin with our old friends the Beach Boys in the fourth quarter of the year. On October 10th, 1972, the Beach Boys submitted the album they've been working on in Holland, which they feel is a strong effort, and they tentatively plan for an October 5th release date. Warner Reprise rejects the album, saying they don't hear a strong single, and the Beach Boys go back to work, this time with Brian and Van Dyke Parks, who revive and restructure a song they'd started working on a few months earlier. Of course, we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the Holland album in a future episode. On October 16th comes a very obscure Beach Boy-related record release, an album of public service announcements from the National Association of Progressive Radio Announcers called Vote 72. According to the album insert, the material ranges from studio recorded spots to actualities caught at concerts and encounters. All of them have the same basic urgent message: the youth vote can make a difference. The youth vote was of particular concern in 1972, since this was the first national election since the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, had been ratified in 1971. Nobody was really sure what or how big an impact this would have on the election. The album contained messages from Jim Dandy of Black Oak, Arkansas, Billy Preston, Flo and Eddie, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, Cheech and Chong, Frank Zappa, and Todd Rundgren, among others, urging young people to vote in November. The album also contained two bands of short, spoken, please vote messages from members of the Beach Boys, one running 20 seconds, the other running 28 seconds. On Election Day, the Beach Boys are in the middle of another North American tour. I have no idea if they voted by absentee ballot or not. Some of the tour posters emphasized that this was a new, modern, hip Beach Boys, using the slogan apparently from manager Jack Riley, "They've changed even more than you." The tour began on November 1st and will wind up on November 23rd with two Thanksgiving Day shows at Carnegie Hall. By early December, the Beach Boys have finished revising their new album, and a release date of January 8th, 1973 is scheduled, just 8 days into the new year. Of course, we'll talk much more about that when we come to 1973. Turning to national news, on October 26, 1972, 2 weeks before the election, with the Vietnam War and peace negotiations ongoing, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger holds a press conference to announce that "we believe peace is at hand." Tuesday, November 7th, was Election Day. After being elected by a narrow margin 4 years earlier, President Nixon won re-election in a landslide against the seemingly hapless Democrats and their candidate, Senator George McGovern. Nixon carried every state except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. He even won McGovern's home state of South Dakota. In his victory speech, Nixon thanked his crowd of supporters for making his last campaign his very best campaign of all. In December, Apollo 17's Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt spent 3 days on the moon. Memorably, they turned up orange soil below the surface just by walking across it. The color was vivid enough to be easily seen on home televisions. Samples would later be determined to come from a volcanic eruption 3.64 billion years ago. It was the last scheduled Apollo moon mission. As they returned to Earth, it was uncertain when man would return to the moon. On December 26th, former President Harry Truman died at the age of 88 after suffering from a series of illnesses. On December 29th, the long popular Life magazine, which began in 1883, published its last weekly issue. Over the following years, Life published special issues and eventually was revived as a monthly magazine. Turning to music, on the final chart of the year, December 30th, there were no albums still in the top 10 that had been there 3 months earlier when the fourth quarter began. Sitting at number 1 was Seventh Sojourn by the Moody Blues, in the fourth of its eventual 5 weeks at number 1. In the third of its 4 weeks at number 2 was Carole King's Rhymes and Reasons album. Unlike her prior 2 number 1 albums, this one would peak at number 2. In the second of its 3 weeks at number 3 was Jethro Tull's Living in the Past set. At its number 4 peak was Al Green's I'm Still in Love with You album. At number 5 was James Taylor's One Man Dog album. This will peak at number 4 on January 13th and January 20th. At number 6 was Cat Stevens' Catch Bull at 4 album. This one had been number 1 for 3 weeks in November and early December. And in the second of its 3 weeks at its number 7 peak, Seals and Crofts' Summer Breeze album. At number 8 was The Temptations' All Directions album. It had gone all the way to number 2 for 2 weeks early in December. Santana's Caravanserai was at number 9. It had spent 2 weeks at number 8 in early December. And at number 10, John Denver entered the top 10 album chart for the first time. This would bounce back down the chart for a while, then return and claim the number 4 position in March of 1973. Top 10 singles on that final chart of the year. At number 1 was Me and Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones by Billy Paul in the last of its 3 weeks in the number 1 spot. At its number 2 peak was Gilbert O'Sullivan's second big U.S. hit, Claire. Al Green's You Ought to Be With Me was at its number 3 peak. You're So Vain by Carly Simon was at number 4 on its way to number 1, where it would spend 3 weeks beginning the next week, January 6th. It Never Rains in Southern California by Albert Hammond was at its number 5 peak. Donna Fargo's crossover country hit Funny Face was at number 6. It would go to number 5 for 2 weeks beginning January 6th. At number 7 was I Am Woman by Helen Reddy. As you can see on the label, the song was featured in a comedy drama about the women's liberation movement, Stand Up and Be Counted. The movie, which starred Jacqueline Bisset, Stella Stevens, and Steve Lawrence, didn't make much of an impact, but the song had gone to number 1 on December 9th and helped make a star out of Helen Reddy. Rockin' Pneumonia and Boogie Woogie Flu by Johnny Rivers was at number 8, on its way to number 6 on January 20th. Curtis Mayfield's Superfly was at number 9. It will go to number 8 for 2 weeks beginning January 13th. And at number 10 was Your Mama Don't Dance by Kenny Loggins with Jim Messina. It'll go to number 4 on January 27th. With crime rates rising and new concerns about health and the environment, many people dreamed of getting back to nature and living closer to the land. The impulse had certainly been around for years, with communes and health food stores springing up around the country, and the popularity of books like Euell Gibbons' Stalking the Wild Asparagus. What had been a hippie pursuit was rapidly becoming more mainstream. You could see it in movies like Jeremiah Johnson and Deliverance, both of which dealt with men challenging the wilderness. On a lighter note, John Denver's hit Rocky Mountain High certainly reflected the feeling, and on TV, the Walton family espoused the virtues of simple rural life. On the newsstands, there were publications to help those who were getting back to the land. The Whole Earth catalog had been publishing product reviews and essays and articles about self-sufficiency for several years. The last Whole Earth catalog was published in June 1971, though regular updates continued for years afterwards. The Mother Earth News was a bi-monthly magazine featuring articles on how to do everything from making your own soap, to creating a sustainable trout farm, to building a low-cost geodesic dome to live in. Subtly, the object of going back to the country seemed to shift from setting up utopian hippie communes to independence, self-sufficiency, and family values. With hippies moving into the country, they were inevitably meeting up with farmers at places like feed stores and farm implement auctions. Many of the hippies came to appreciate the farmers for their knowledge of the land and farming techniques, and to appreciate their straightforward small-town values. Meanwhile, some of the farmers and many of their kids began to sprout sideburns, beards, and mustaches, and in some cases grow a new crop that the Nixon administration had classified as a Schedule I controlled substance. Primed by the likes of Bob Dylan and the Byrds, a lot of hippies began to appreciate country music, switching the radio in the truck over to the local country station. Meanwhile, some of the farmers began to flip the switch on the radio in the barn over to the FM rock station. This unexpected convergence of hippies and rednecks became pervasive pretty quickly in the early 70s, and I think explains the existence of Willie Nelson. With hippies and rednecks becoming harder to tell apart, it made it easier for people in the middle to get back to the land too, since by doing so you were no longer declaring yourself to be one thing or the other. I think the Beach Boys' decision to uproot and move to Holland also owed something to this get back to nature impulse, probably also owed something to the new and growing trend of rock stars recording in exotic locales, but the music that they made in Holland, I think, certainly reflects the back to nature spirit. Anyway, there's a little digression for you. Let's talk about television. As the year ended, the top 10 U.S. TV programs were at number 1, All in the Family, still kicking off the Saturday night lineup on CBS. At number 2, Sanford and Son, another hit from Norman Lear kicking off NBC's Friday night lineup. At number 3, Hawaii Five-0, now in its 5th season, Tuesday nights on CBS. On CBS Tuesday nights, just ahead of Hawaii Five-0, was the number 4 rated Maude, the new series from All in the Family creator Norman Lear. At number 5 was Bridget Loves Bernie, another new series, Saturday nights on CBS right after All in the Family. At number 6 was the NBC Sunday Mystery Movie, featuring McCloud starring Dennis Weaver, McMillan and Wife starring Rock Hudson and Susan St. James, and Peter Falk as Columbo, all back for a 2nd season. New in the fall of 1972 was a 4th series, Richard Boone as Heck Ramsey. The Mary Tyler Moore Show was in 7th place in its 3rd season on CBS, following All in the Family and Bridget Loves Bernie. At number 8 was Gunsmoke, still ruling Monday nights in its 18th season on CBS. The Wonderful World of Disney was at number 9. It had been a staple of Sunday nights for 19 seasons on NBC. And at number 10 was Ironside, starring Raymond Burr, in its 6th season, Thursday nights on NBC, right after the Flip Wilson Show. On December 31st, ABC presented a new kind of New Year's Eve program. In prior years, the big New Year's Eve special had been on CBS, with Guy Lombardo and the Royal Canadians hosting from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Lombardo had already been doing his show for 43 years at that point, beginning on radio in 1938. Producer and TV personality Dick Clark thought, not unreasonably, that there might be an opening to appeal to a younger audience, and on this night launched a new program, New Year's Rockin' Eve, with Three Dog Night, Al Green, Blood, Sweat and Tears, Helen Reddy, and Billy Preston at the Queen Mary in Long Beach, and Dick Clark covering the action in Times Square. The show drew good ratings and would become a New Year's Eve tradition over many years to come. And that seems like the best place to leave the year 1972, ringing it out with Dick Clark and the New Year's Rockin' Eve gang. I hope you enjoyed this extremely deep dive into the year 1972. I look forward to your comments, look forward to reminiscences if you remember those days. Also, if I left out anything really crucial over these 8 episodes, I hope we caught the high points at least, but let me know if I missed anything that I really should have covered. I look forward to your comments. Please hit like and subscribe if you don't mind. We will return next week with some other Beach Boy topic that will not involve the year 1972. We'll take a little break from that. Of course, we will eventually return to talk about 1973 and the Holland album at some point in the future. Meanwhile, have a good week. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.